Hey everyone, welcome to the video version of the Reviving Vet Med podcast. Today we're diving into how veterinary teams experience safety, support, and leadership, a topic that sits at the intersection of patient safety, team culture, and well-being. We'll explore how leadership behaviors, psychological safety, and everyday interactions shape whether teams feel safe to speak up, learn from their mistakes, and care for one another when things go wrong. My guest today is Dr. Luiz Santos, a board certified veterinary anesthesiologist and senior clinician in veterinary anesthesia at the University of Glasgow. Luiz combines active clinical practice with education and leadership in patient safety, with a strong focus on simulation based training and the development of non technical skills for students, interns, and residents. Alongside his clinical role, Luiz is completing a PhD applying human factors principles to improve patient safety in veterinary medicine. His research explores humble leadership, psychological safety, safety climate, error disclosure, and the second victim phenomenon, as well as the impact of incivility on team dynamics, communication, and safety outcomes. In this episode, Luiz and I unpack why these concepts mean so much in day to day veterinary practice, and why error disclosure remains so challenging, and how humble leadership and patient safety culture can support learning and well being. I am so excited for this episode. It was a great conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you. Here's my conversation with Dr. Luiz Santos. Hello, Luiz. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So for listeners who might be new to this space, how do you define humble leadership, psychological safety, and safety climate? And why do these concepts matter so much in vet medicine today?
That's a good question. I think when we talk about patient safety in veterinary medicine, a lot of people immediately think about protocols, checklists, monitoring equipment, especially my area of expertise in anesthesia. But don't get me wrong, those things absolutely matter, but they're not where safety actually starts. Uh, for me, safety starts with how people treat each other, right? And that's one of the foundational works that I do in terms of incivility. And that's just one arm of human factors. So when I talk about humble leadership, psychological safety, safety climate, I think of them as three parts of the same picture. So humble leadership is about how leaders show up to the day to day. Basically, it's not about being soft or inclusive. And a lot of people ask me, was like, "Oh, being humble is about being vulnerable and crying." It's not about that. That's actually a misconception. It's about being open and being curious, being comfortable, saying things like, "I don't know, I might be wrong here." And those are some of the things that humble leaders usually say to people. And psychological safety, I think this is something that people are seeing more and more in practice, and it's actually quite spoken, especially in social media and workshops nowadays. So psychological safety is what that behavior creates. It's whether people feel safe to speak up, ask questions, admit mistakes without worrying they will be blamed or that they will feel stupid, basically. So it's basically Amy Edmondson that studies psychological safety. She speaks about taking is being safe to taking interpersonal risks, right? To be able to speak up. Safety climate is the bigger picture, right? When we talk about climate, we're talking about a section of the culture of a company. Sometimes in your company, you have several climates. My organization, I work in anesthesia. My anesthesia service is a climate. So there's a safety climate in that part of the organization. Obviously, we have an overall safety culture across the organization. So safety climate is we still talk about the bigger picture. Is that shared sense that the team uh, for the team safety patient safety actually means something that actually matters in practice, not just policies or posters on the wall and that kind of stuff, you know. So for me, these concepts they all matter because our work is very complex. It's a high pressure environment, veterinary medicine, such as healthcare and aviation, etc. But and it's often quite hierarchical, and that's where humble leadership comes into play with all those connections. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think of, I love what you said about humble leadership being this ability to say, I don't know. What do you think? I need your input. And to admit when you make mistakes or that you don't have all the answers. And I think that's so important, for you and I, you working in anesthesia and me working in the ICU, where it is such high stakes and there's so many things that can go wrong. I think it sounds to me like humble leadership is what can feed into psychological safety. And then that has a big impact on the overall safety climate, what almost sounds like a culture, right? The climate or the culture
Correct.
within the space. And you mentioned the hierarchy of vet medicine, and this seems to be something I'm hearing a lot about these days. A lot of people talking about power dynamics and team members not feeling able to speak up or feeling quite a lot of distress when they have to talk to their superior or bring a concern up to somebody who is perceived to be above them. Why do you think leadership style has such a powerful influence on whether people do speak up or, for example, say that they've made a mistake?
Well, it's my impression, and the study that I've done is still veterinary medicine is still very hierarchical. Whether we like it or not, it's still a fact. And you have probably agree with me that this is still in place. And hierarchy at some levels, it's beneficial. We think about hierarchy nowadays as potentially hazard, but there is benefits. And uh, those kinds of environments where our hierarchy is too separated, the pyramid is quite high. It's funny because I'm a senior I'm a senior clinician here in my organization, and I see this firsthand when my juniors they they're constantly reading the room, right? They're constantly looking at you, what you're going to be your next move, what are you going to say, and in stressful situations, that power dynamics plays quite strongly. But I feel like they are asking themselves, for example, is this a safe moment to say something? And we see this with the students as well. They stop and they think about, and we're like, come on, you can say, what are you thinking? Bring it up. But it's up to us. It's up to the seniors to the or the residents in this case when the student dealing with students is that hierarchical grade to be able to allow these individuals that are starting on an organization or they are new to an organization to be able to speak up and brings the psychological safety again. So I don't know what's your opinion about that.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that until you said it, that we do need some sort of hierarchy. And I think about that during, of course, the biggest analogy I can make is CPR, right? Somebody has to
Mm,
take the lead. Somebody has to be guiding the scenario. And I think that's also important for wellness in organizations is that you know where to go if you do need support, right? If you do have a concern, you need to know what avenues you can take to be able to voice that. And so I think hierarchy has a bad rap, and I do think in some ways it can have negative consequences, but I almost think of it like a structure. And
yeah,
what you're saying is that it sounds like we those of us who find ourselves on the top of that pyramid or on the top of that hierarchy who have that perceived higher power, we have a lot of power in the sense of creating that safety for people to
correct.
speak up. And I was in academia for 5 years and I know exactly what you're talking about, where, you'll see the students and their wheels are turning and they're writing stuff down and they want to ask a question
Mm.
and they're trying to suss out the situation. And yeah, same goes for the interns and residents too.
I
And
I I visited an organization, Marie, that they apply the opposite. They try to flatten the hierarchy so much that everybody can speak up, but there's no one making the high decision. And that actually conflicts with what I don't think in human, when we study human factors, we don't want to flatten the hierarchy to the level of nobody's in charge. There's always, like you said in CPR, I always tell my students is like having an orchestra without a conductor. That's going to go crazy, you know?
Yeah.
So I like to always do that analogy.
Yeah,
So
that's a
not too much, but not too flatten.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and it speaks to the complexity of this, and leads to, I think, a lot of self-reflection on the part of leaders to really think about how they are conducting themselves, pardon the pun, with the orchestra analogy, and how that is leading members of their team to speak up or participate or admit mistakes or ask for help, or not. And that brings me, I guess, to my next question, a big question, which is I'm curious, what led you to focus on this research for your PhD? Why did you, and I know you're in anesthesia, so there is a lot at stake, but this focus on patient safety, error disclosure, and leadership, what turned you toward this area?
That built very organic throughout the this my PhD. I'm nearly done with my PhD, but honestly, I came from clinical experience, you know. I don't think if I had lived all these things throughout my career, I wouldn't be able to study. And oftentimes what we see is, especially in my country, in Brazil, we see a lot of individuals going to do studies right after they graduate to do a master's and PhD. And I that's for me, it's key to leave those experiences to be able to study them. And for me, I'm grateful to have lived those experiences, to be able to know, okay, that happened to me. We should study this. So I think, like most vets, I've seen errors and near misses, but what stayed with me wasn't just the events themselves, you know. Um, it was how hard they were to talk about. It's still a very niched area of we don't see many studies out there. One foundational work that I remember seeing from the UK here where I work is from Catherine Oxtoby talking. The title of the paper was "We Need to Talk About Errors," and that for me was like, Jesus, we do need to talk about errors. You know, so there was this disconnect of what we do in practice to we're missing data here, right? And healthcare is doing this for now over 20 years, researching psychological safety, errors, how the impact of errors, the second victim phenomenon we can talk about later. So I think all that kind of was brewing in my mind that it needed to be researched. And that's why I went forward with it. Yeah.
hmm I remember reading that paper and actually talking about it in my book that I wrote. And it's such an important distinction, like you said. I think we do have a little bit of research, probably not enough, but we do have some on error frequency, adverse events, and so on in vet medicine. It seems to be a growing body of interest, and yet there isn't this focus on the probably the most important thing, which is we can't really gauge the number of errors and why they're happening if we're not looking at the ability for people to say that they've made a mistake. So
Yeah.
going to the root of it once again, I found it so interesting in your research that you found that humble leadership, which is this quality that we've talked about, doesn't directly increase error exposure, but it works actually through psychological safety and safety climate. Can you just say in your own words and maybe in relationship to your work in the anesthesia department, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting findings from my research on this subject on leadership style, this particular leadership style, is that being the humility in leadership doesn't necessarily translate into people disclosing more of their errors, their adverse events and the mistakes, etc. Instead, it works indirectly. We did a mediation analysis where we saw that humble leadership creates the development of psychological safety within teams. And over time, that builds into a positive safety climate, which is this shared belief that safety and learning actually matter to the team. And that's what enables disclosure. Um, that's what we found is that your leader, your manager, your boss can be very humble, but that doesn't necessarily leads to you being able to disclose something to your supervisor, to your boss, or to the clients about the mistakes that it was made. So in simple terms, leadership is what I like this analogy. Leadership is what plants the seed. Psychological safety is the soil, and disclosure is what grows, is the outcome, right? But only if the environment is right. So you need to have the safety climate in or culture embedded in your organization to be able to have the flower or plant grow.
I love that analogy. And it just speaks to the power of the climates in which we work,
Mm.
the cultures that we find ourselves in. And we see this throughout vet medicine, even looking in other ways, just even the wellness climate or the well-being climate and how we talk about mental health or how we behave around mental health. If I can use a different analogy in that regard, it would be like, you have a manager who tells you, you need to take care of your mental health. You need to take breaks. You need to take your mental health days, et cetera, et cetera. If you work within a culture in which nobody takes breaks, nobody takes their mental health days, nobody talks about their mental health, it's not going to happen. Which
Exactly.
is disheartening, for
Is
those of
this
us who are
Arne?
trying to enact change, because you want to empower individuals like leaders to start these changes. And at the same time, I guess we can take comfort in knowing that is what starts it, right? That is
Yeah.
the seed, like you said, that gets planted, and then hopefully in time, under the right
Conditions.
conditions, thank
Yeah.
you, that it can grow. You in your research, you included a wide range of roles. And again, you and I
Mm.
both work very closely with different roles in our environments. We have our nurses, sometimes we have assistants, students, interns, residents, etc. And I know you included nurses to practice owners. What stood out to you about how perceptions differed across the different roles and settings that you looked at?
Yeah, this was an interesting finding from our research. Well, I'm not surprised. You're probably not surprised either when you read probably the paper that uh, people experience the same workplace very differently. I think when you go to work, when you talk to the frontline staff versus the manager and your leader, they're gonna tell you a different story what's happening, right? How they picture the organization and how they picture the work as it's done. So for us, what we found is that senior leaders, managers, hospital directors, owners often felt the environment was very open and supportive, and they generally meant that. But nurses, interns, early career vets often have a different experience. So people in more vulnerable roles as well, which more sensitive to tone, reactions, and past experiences. So if speaking up wasn't going well before, they were far less likely to try again. That's what I mean. Um, it really reinforced the idea that leaders don't get to decide whether a workplace is safe. Look at this. Uh, so it's not up to the leaders. It's the people that is with the least power that they do. And I put power in quotes because they do the hard job on the front line. And these are the individuals that really do know what we're missing, what we can improve. And sometimes we don't involve them in the decision-making process um, of an organization in terms of patient safety.
Yeah, which is such a shame because clearly their opinions matter, and it is almost an indicator of what the overall climate is, right? You can have those leaders that in their perception, I'm laughing only because I know exactly what you're talking about. And we see this across multiple studies in the wellness space where the managers have a very different perception, as you said, especially than the nurses or technicians. There seems to be quite a disparity there. And yeah, when you put it like that, it really does come down to that power. And I've certainly been in those situations where you learn very quickly, right? If you speak up and you get shut down, criticized, ridiculed, even maybe not even about a mistake, but just about a case, asking a question or suggesting a different way of managing a case. And if you get, shot down, so to speak, especially by a senior person, and especially I find too in front of other people, it just sets the tone that like that is not what we do here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like it's one of those things where you only have to do it once and you're like never again.
Have
So
you ever seen that show on I don't know if they're still airing that show. It's I think it was the first time in London in here in the UK that the boss gets disguised. He dressed himself as an employee that just started. Have you ever seen that show?
yeah, I'm
And
having a hard time remembering what it is, but it's like
I
the
know
hidden boss.
Boss Uncovered, something
Yeah,
like this. But
undercover boss or
undercover
something.
boss, yes. That for me is something that we need to see in veterinary medicine. Somebody from higher up coming and dressing as a nurse and being in the front line and actually seeing what it is,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
giving value for those individuals that are there. And I'm not saying that everybody's like that, but some CEOs, especially the corporates, just coming and seeing what these people are doing, machines that are missing, protocols that are the number of mortality, morbidity that's happening in ICU or an anesthesia, just to give an example, and improving protocols based on I've been there, I've seen it.
Hmm.
So I always like that analogy, and I talk to people. It's like I wish I could dress myself fancy like that and come down, but it is up to talking to people on the front line, and doing the job, that everyday job, the difficulties, asking how they're doing, what they're
Hmm.
needing. I think that's what it is all about, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, it's something I talk a lot about in my leadership training, where it is so important to have that face time on the floor. I think even better if you're in a role where you can actually work on the floor. And we certainly have a lot of nurses and technicians that have gone into leadership roles and still continue to, plug the gaps, give people breaks, and have that floor time. I think it garners a lot of respect. I think it garners a lot of understanding about what the challenges are. And it's a very different seat to sit, in the office, so to speak, and looking from above down on what's happening versus being, like you said, on the front lines, in the trenches, whatever analogy that you want to use, and actually doing the work. And so if you are not in a position where you can do the work, definitely having that on the floor FaceTime with your team members so that you can observe and notice and really be first witness to what it is that they're experiencing.
Mm.
Louise, you've written also about the second victim phenomenon, and I'm curious for you to unpack that, and especially in the context of psychological safety. How does psychological safety or the lack of it shape how clinicians cope or anybody on the team when something does go wrong?
Yeah, this is something that the terminology second victim phenomena comes from healthcare, but we can apply this terminology in veterinary medicine because these are the individuals that provide care to our patients and to the clients. So we say second victim is are the individuals that are affected psychologically, physically, professionally by an adverse event that was done to the patient and the client. So the patient and client would be the first victim of um, a mistake, and the second victim would be the provider. So I've spoken to clinicians who made very similar mistakes yeah, or mistakes in general, but the recovery of making a mistake is looked completely different between individuals. So the pathway from recovering from when you make a mistake, I don't know, Marie, if you ever done a mistake that traumatized you. I probably do. I done many times, but it's how you overcome that trauma is what shapes your path again to being successful in your career. So, for example, for very junior vets, I see that trauma can be very challenging to continue, and some of these individuals end up dropping out, or something more sinister happening. But and that brings me down to leadership. See how it's all interconnected is the leadership supporting individuals that make mistakes, that they are open, psychologically safe to speak up and say, yes, I've done it. I cut the wrong leg of this patient. And I need help because I'm traumatized by the event. And having that support, not only from leadership, but from colleagues, our research actually show that the first thing second victims want is somebody to talk to and a peer support, a friend, a colleague from that environment. Talking to family and friends don't show value, doesn't doesn't help with moving on. Does make sense? They prefer to kind of talk to somebody that is in there and that they trust.
Yeah, I think it speaks to that been there, done that affirmation and validation, the normalization that mistakes are okay. I know that there's research looking at disclosure, not necessarily errors, but just disclosure of challenging events within a Facebook group. And it was a study where they looked at mental health scores like depression, anxiety, compassion fatigue. And what they found is that when somebody in the group, a veterinarian, disclosed something challenging that happened to them at work, if it was met with compassion, validation, and care, their mental health scores actually went up. And we see this across human beings in general, right? That
Yeah.
those individuals that feel supported, they feel like they've got someone to turn to when things are challenging. And in this case, like you said, somebody who gets it. And I don't think
Mm.
there's anything that feels more comforting when somebody has made a mistake than to turn to somebody and tell them and have them say, yeah, I've done that too. It's awful. It
And
sucks.
especially coming from a leader, from a supervisor, from your boss, right? How
Yeah.
powerful is you share those moments with your team
hmm
and
I think this is
reflect.
I think this is something we don't talk about enough in vet medicine. And I wrote about, I have a chapter in my book on mistakes. And in the chapter, I share a story about Lacey, a dog in the ICU at the time. This is during my residency at NC State. And she was a medicine case. She had a whole plethora of issues, lymphoma, a benign brain tumor, and she was hospitalized for pancreatitis. And she needed a feeding tube. Medicine was busy. I facilitated the feeding tube with one of my nurses. And it was one of those days, it was a Friday afternoon. Everything was bonkers in the ICU. Our radiology machine, our digital radiographs weren't bringing them to the computer. So we had to go down to radiology to look at them on the main screen. And the tube was placed, and initially it was in the esophagus. It was just turned back on itself. And so I said to my nurse, just pull it out a little bit. It should flip forward, take a rad, and then we should be good to go. Well, I left and she did her thing. I didn't realize she took the whole tube out and then put it back in. And so she went and took the radiograph, and I ran to radiology to look at the radiograph. And I just looked to see that the tube was straight. It was straight. It was, positioned towards the diaphragm. And I said, yep, it looks good. I didn't look at the entire film, and I didn't realize until the radiologist called me the following Monday to say, hey, we just wanted to make sure you knew that that's the trachea. And of course, she had already been fed into the tube, and she had a cardiopulmonary arrest, and she died the first night.
Oh my God.
And so it was horrifying. That gutted me. And it was weeks that I was scared to make any decisions. I was scared to do procedures. I never wanted to interpret radiographs. And it was a couple of months later that my mentor we were on ICU together, and I remember him saying to me, Marie, like, you've got to let that case go. And I was like, I can't. Like, I don't think I deserve to finish my residency. I don't think I should be here. And he
Yeah.
said, do you know how many patients that I've killed in my career because of mistakes I made? And I couldn't believe it. Nobody had ever told me that they had made a mistake, let alone this mentor that I looked up to who was double boarded and super smart and the most compassionate, kind human. And he just said it like it was just normal. He's like, it's going to
Mm.
happen. It's going to happen again. This is part of what we do. And that honestly, from that moment on, I could find that humility in the work that we do and recognize that we are infallible and that it's okay, that it happens to everybody. And most importantly, the way that we talk about it and
Yeah.
how we approach it has such a difference because up until that point, I was so entrenched in shame that I wouldn't talk to anybody about it. I didn't want my resident mates to know. I was like, everybody's going to think I'm incompetent. Like, nobody's going to want to work with me. It was so shame provoking. And then after that, and of course to this day, I talk openly about that case and the many mistakes that I continue to make in my career, because it is so important to normalize it and give people permission to make mistakes and talk about them too.
Yeah, if you did, probably if you didn't have that individual to talk to, you would probably be doing something different. People move on, they do something different, they change. I don't want to do ECC, I will do something more basic, GP. You're absolutely right. I think your story is very appropriate to summarize with the psychological impact, physical, psychological, professional impact of second victim and the mistakes that occur. Um, we need to normalize these conversations, Marie. Uh, we tend to be we vets more than nurses tend to think of ourselves as superheroes and close our emotions, especially in front of our juniors and students. And there's nothing more humble to uh, is to be vulnerable. It's to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is one of the key ingredients for trust, right? If you think you know
Absolutely.
everything, forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for
Absolutely.
sharing that. That was very powerful.
Oh,
Appreciate
well,
that.
thank you for listening. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I follow very closely the work of Brene Brown and her leadership work especially. And she speaks to leaders needing to be vulnerable in order to maintain that trust within their team and to not stand up there like they always have the answers and they, never make mistakes and all of those things because it just it's hard to connect and relate to somebody like that. Um, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about incivility in veterinary practice because I know that's a strong area of interest and research for you as well. How do you think everyday incivility undermines psychological safety and patient safety, even when it seems minor or normal? Because we all know
Mm.
the environment that we can live in vet medicine. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I work with disability as my hobby, I guess. I've been doing some research with the University of Aberdeen here in UK, and I'm very thankful for them to include me on their research. They are the mastermind behind the incivility studies in veterinary medicine. But when we talk about incivility, people often think about extreme behaviors, right? Shouting, overt bullying, and not necessarily. Most of the incivility that we see, they end up undermining what we talk about psychological safety. Much quieter tone. For example, you've probably seen this already when a nurse comes to talk to you when you're on your phone or in your computer, you don't direct your eye contact to the individual, or the person you mentioned something, the person just do an eye roll, a slight sarcastic comment. So this is what we call indirect incivility, and not as overt as shouting and barking and physical abuse. But so incivility has these different modalities that we see. I had people say to me, for example, I stopped asking questions, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to feel stupid. And that's very common for students when they feel belittled or they're called out in front of their peers, and so it's very relatable to psychological safety because incivility will erode trust. It will erode the power of speaking up. If that person was nasty to me, why do I bother actually? So everything is interconnected. So those small moments, they add up, especially the indirect type of incivility. Um, I've been, I don't know if I have this book here in next to me. I don't know if you ever seen um, The Power of Mattering from Zach Mercurio. I'm reading this book at the moment, and it's such an amazing book. I don't want to do any sponsors, but it's such an amazing book because it talks about anti-mattering instead of mattering. He explains what matter is at work, why it's important to matter at work, but he talks about anti-mattering. And there's a story on the book that talks about this maintenance worker that noticed she does the garden every day. So she does the windows of the office every day, and the sprinklers of the office or the garden they are directed they're directly towards the window. So she's cleaning the window, but when it comes afternoon, those sprinklers pop up and they end up making a mess. So she raised this concern with her supervisor, suggesting a very simple fix: adjust the sprinkler aiming elsewhere to save time and effort so I don't have to come and do it again. And instead of being acknowledged, she was shut down. So basically, he describes in the book that the supervisor tells the maintenance worker, that's the sprinklers problems people. That's their problem. That's not our problem. I need you to just do your job. And what do you think that makes to that individual? What happens to that individual? She felt that she was engaged. She was able to speak up. She brings ideas that maybe we should do something here, so I don't have to do double work. So she feels silenced. She felt dismissed. She felt insignificant. So why bother? Speaking up and talking about. So this is what antimatter means in the book. And I found that fascinating because that relates to incivility in some ways, right? I don't know what you think. Have you ever heard about this book?
I haven't heard about it, but I'm going to add it to my reading list and we'll link it up in the show notes as well. I
Nice.
mean, there's so much to unpack here. What I hear you saying is that your nonverbal communication can be huge when it comes to these, what did you call them, minor or micro incivilities?
Yeah, well, but indirect incivilities, I
Indirect.
would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indirect. So you're not directly addressing somebody with sarcasm or, mean, like you said, more mean comments, bullying, this kind of thing, but it could just be sarcasm or the tone or your facial expression or a simple not directing eye contact.
Yeah.
And we always talk about how nonverbals carry such a huge weight in our day-to-day communication. And again, it just speaks to us as leaders, and of course, everybody on the team has a responsibility for how they communicate with each other. But wow, just recognizing those little subtle nuances can have such a large lasting impact, even if it is just a sigh and then a turning towards somebody like, oh, you're like adding so much to my day that you're asking these questions. And I feel like that was something I really experienced periodically in vet school, depending on which rotation I was on. And I allude to this when I talk about the hidden curriculum, which is
Mm.
that, the formal curriculum would say, oh yeah, we want you to learn, we want you to ask questions, we want you to to come to us, if there's something that doesn't make sense, and that informally or it's hidden when you get into the hidden curriculum on your rotations, is that don't ask any stupid questions in front of the client. In fact, don't even ask questions in front of the client unless you want to look incompetent. Don't question
Exactly.
me. We'll only have time for that during rounds, and rounds is only if we have time. At the end of the day, it just is such it's just giving such a different message. And so, what I hear you saying is that at the end of the day, you can have an individual that does speak up. And if the way in which they are addressed, if it includes any of these nuances of incivility, it's really going to impact whether they do that again. So, it's really going to damage that patient safety climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that it has a knock-on effect on I see this in the students because they talk to each other, right? And if that happens to one of them, the other one will become extremely anxious to the rotations and be scared of that individual, and they don't learn. Impacts learning completely. It's something that we try to address in our organization, and I'm sure that happens elsewhere as well.
It absolutely does. And like you said, it's the rumors will spread, and then people will either go on to services working with those individuals or through rotations or whatever it might be, and they're just in survival mode. They're just doing what they can to get by while feeling really uncomfortable, and that they're just surviving. They're not learning, they're not growing, they're not certainly not thriving. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
thank you for explaining that. I want to share with our listeners and those people watching some tangible strategies for what they can do if this is something that they now have an awareness about, hopefully, and they want to make a change. For those who are in ownership roles or management roles, or even senior clinicians, like you said, even residents when they're working with students, what are one or two humble leadership behaviors that will have the biggest impact on safety and learning?
Oh, that's a good question. If I had to pick one or two, it would be this. I think first, how leaders respond when something goes wrong. I think for me, that's key, and that fits with what I do as a research. So very calm, curious response, like, help me understand what happened with this case, instead of, why did you do that? Sends a very powerful message to the individual. So I think how we speak to individuals, bringing the hierarchy again, how us seniors speak to juniors when they make mistake or something goes wrong. I think the second is being being willing to acknowledge fallibility. We talked about this on psychological safety when we talk about psychological safety, but when you shared your emotional experience uh, with your case in ICU, I think is we are fallible, we're human. So I once saw a senior clinician start a debrief of an event and start by saying, "I think I missed something today." Just by saying that, it changed the tone of the conversation, and we were like much more at ease. There was no defense mechanism. It was like, I just missed something today. Can you help me understand what happened? You know, being vulnerable. So those moments, for me, I think are very powerful and brings and helps builds trust in the relationship between individuals. And that's, I think, that would be my two key um, kind of tips,
I
if I
love
say.
that. Very tangible and have a huge, huge impact. Um, so then if we turn to our team members who aren't necessarily in formal leadership roles, what can they do to support psychological safety within their teams that they're a part of?
Yeah, I guess this is something that people have a misconception that psychological safety is a top-down situation. It's not. It's Psychological safety isn't just created by people with titles and power. Some of the strongest safety cultures I've ever seen were built through everyday peer behavior. Thanking someone for speaking up, or doing a good job, checking in after a tough case, like a colleague, a nurse colleague, talking to another nurse colleague, or simply listening without judgment. That's all sometimes what we need is individuals to share a story and to be able to be there for us. So you don't need a manager or an owner to make someone feel that their voice matters. And coming back to mattering, um, uh, and that brings me to this book again about mattering, because you don't you don't you don't need leaders to acknowledge that. You can have a colleague saying to you, Marie, I trust you. I made a mistake, but I trust you because you're an amazing clinician. You've done several of these uh, procedures where you put a tube in the esophagus, and how many of them go right? And we always focus on what go wrong. And that's why I think that the main shift that we have in veterinary medicine during my PhD, I was talking to my examiners, is why do we focus so much on the error? Why do we focus so much on the mistakes? Definitely that impacts us more. But we should shift the culture into why do actually things go right most of the time. And we talk about this as safety too, in human factors, is what we do that 99% of the time we get things right, despite the fact that it's a challenging boil environment that makes everything go pear-shaped. You know what I mean? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think this applies to so many things in our lives, right? We're
Mm,
human. We have this inherent negativity bias. When we make a mistake or there's an adverse event, it's extraordinarily painful. It goes against everything we stand for in our work. And so we want to do everything we can to never experience that again. And so we focus on it. We want to ruminate on it and figure it out and just
yeah,
avoid rather than countering that with all of the things that have gone well and all of the times, like you said, we've placed that tube without incident or we've knocked down a patient and intubated them without anything happening. It's human nature, I think, and I think there's still that big shame component that
mm,
you just, yeah, feeling so distressed by it and feeling so isolated if we are not in an environment that normalizes that happening.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Louise, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so passionate about this topic, and you've opened up my eyes to so many different important factors that go into play when it comes to medical errors and how we talk about them, and the role that leadership plays, and the climate or the culture plays, and of course that it goes back to every team member that is in the workplace. I want to leave you with one last question, which is a question that I ask all of our guests on the podcast. And that is, what does the phrase reviving veterinary medicine mean to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I had to think about this for a moment to really see something that resonates with me and my research. I guess for me, reviving veterinary medicine means you talked about survival mode, and that's exactly what I thought about. Is like moving away from the survival mode. I feel like our profession is on the verge of this, or if not, already on it. We are in survival mode. Um, so I think it's about creating workplaces where learning from error is normal. I think that's a big message for me, is where people are supported after difficult events and where excellent compassion actually can exist together. And when we get that right, we just don't protect patients, we protect the people who care for them. And that to me is what really sustains the profession.
Beautifully said. What a great way to end. Thank you so much for your time today, Louise. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you, Marie.